Hi everyone, welcome to Bonnie Carolee Makes Cards. Simon Says Stamps, totally unforgettable. What can I say? This is the cutest. And what do you do with the cutest of the cute? You make interactive cards. One card will use an interactive element called the swing reveal, while the other two will feature two different kinds of sliders. We'll get started with one of the sliders, this cute little frog floating lazily down a river on a leaf. Now how cute is that? I begin by stamping all the frogs that I'm going to be using for the cards on Neenah Classic Crest 110-pound cardstock using Memento ink. All of the frogs will be Copic colored, and this ink is Copic friendly. All of the frogs were colored in exactly the same way, so I will just show you the one for this card, the little frog on the leaf. All of these cuties were Copic colored. For the leaf, I used YG 61, 63, and 67. All of the frogs were colored with G12, 14, and 17. This frog determined the colors for all of the frogs because of the leaf. I actually approached this backwards. I like the tones in the YG 60 range, and so I naturally reach for them when I'm doing greenery. So then it took a little bit of work to find a range of greens that would help that frog stand out from the leaf while still complementing those tones. You can see on my paper just a couple of a few swatches that I tried to see what would work best. In the end, I decided to go with a brighter green. So who knows? Even if I had started with the frog before the leaf, perhaps I would have chosen this range of greens anyways. The coloring goes quite quickly. I find that when I'm coloring a number of elements, in this case the frogs, in exactly the same way, the first one I spend a bit more time because I'm figuring out where are those shadows and highlights going to go. I use the first frog as a bit of a map work to help me color the rest of the frogs, and they go up very quickly. So in no time at all, I have all of my frogs colored and I'm ready to fussy cut them. The outlines for the images in this stamp set don't have intricate details, so they are very easy to fussy cut. I chose to fussy cut them right on the line rather than leaving some white space like you often get with a die cut. Choosing to cut on the line does have its drawbacks because any small imperfections will show. However, it is just as easy to make them disappear. Using a dark marker, in this case I've used a Copic C10, I just run along the edge of the image. Many dark markers will work. A word of caution if you choose to use a Copic marker like I'm using. I am careful not to apply too much pressure. The cut edge will absorb the ink and you don't want to have that look of a bleed. The frog is ready to go. Now it's time to start building that interactive background. The basic inking for the background on Bristol Smooth cardstock was done off camera. Stress oxide inks were used for all of the cards. The background was stenciled. I used Simon Says Stamps Cloud for Days for the sky with tumbled glass, and then their stencil called Waves with a combination of cracked pistachio and salty ocean for the river. I used one of the dies from Lawn Fawn's Slide On Over to cut the slider opening, and I made sure that I retained the die cut piece. I'm going to add some additional detail to the river. To begin, I'm going to stamp some wave details with one of the stamps that is included in the Totally Unforgettable stamp set. The stamp is flexible, and I try to line it up so that it follows the curve of the horizon. I stamp with Versamark ink, and then emboss it in white. I will be repeatedly stamping this image. After each stamping, I melt the embossing powder before I go on to the next one. After the horizon is completed, which only takes 2 stampings, I then repeat this detail halfway between the horizon and the bottom of the card. Into the spatter box it goes. The sky is protected with a piece of copy paper and some post-it note tape. I add a little bit of water to white gouache, and with my smallest watercolor brush, I apply a fine spatter. I've inserted the die cut piece back in so that it can receive the same detailing. You need some dimension with the slider, and I'm going to use sheet foam. I use the panel to help line up the slider die onto the foam. It is easy to position so that the die cut opening in the foam will match that of the panel. A little bit of post-it note tape is used to hold that die in place as I feed it through the die cutting machine. The panel is adhered to the foam. The foam has stretched a bit as the result of going through the die cutter, and I trim those little bits off. The panel is going to be mounted on sea glass cardstock. I'm not ready to mount one on the other, but I am going to adhere the die cut. The inlay piece will help minimize the look of the slider opening. The 2 sentiments are lined up on my MISTI. Each one will be stamped differently. I don't want to remove one of them while I stamp the other. The main sentiment is masked with a post-it note while I ink up the other with black VersaFine ink. Of course, the mask comes off before I stamp it. Now I can remove the secondary stamp so that the main one can be inked with a combination of Salty Ocean and Cracked Pistachio. Just in case I clean up any of the ink that's on the MISTI door. My first impression isn't perfect, so I re-ink and stamp it a second time. The frog will be attached to a cardstock circle through the slider die cut. Small foam squares are attached to the circle. The frog is then positioned on the foam squares. When I put this main panel on the base, the frog wasn't moving as smoothly as I wanted it to along the slider. So I decided to add another piece of foam backing. I start off by just roughly marking out where that slider is. I use a rectangle die to cut the opening, knowing that I'm going to have to expand the width. The cardstock circle that the frog is attached to needs to move freely along the slider. I just use my scissors to increase the width of the opening. The additional piece of foam is adhered to the main panel. The excess foam is trimmed and it is adhered to the sea glass cardstock layer. It is then adhered to a slimline card base that measures 8 3/4 inches by 3 3/4 inches. The card is finished up with a combination of clear and aqua sequins. As I place them, I'm constantly running that frog along its slider and repositioning them as needed. Once everything is in place and I know the frog isn't going to knock them off, they are adhered to the panel and then topped off with Nouveau Crystal Drops Morning Dew. Sea Breeze Jewel Drops are added to the droplets of water on the leaf. I also add Morning Dew drops to the frog's eyes, which makes them look pretty weird now, but when they're dry, they're clear and his eyes really pop. The 2 little butterflies included in the stamp set are placed on an acrylic block and stamped with Copic-friendly Memento ink. The butterflies are colored simply with Copic markers, one in blues and the other in greens. They are finished off with Nouveau Glitter Drops White Blizzard. When the white blizzard is dry, it is clear, leaving a very sparkly effect on this pair of butterflies. And that completes this slider card. And now on to the swing reveal. This is another fun interactive card that is easy to make. The frog for this card was stamped and colored right on its panel. No fussy cutting for this one. I die cut a circle that was large enough to cover the frog out of Bristol Smooth cardstock, and then did some ink blending with cracked pistachio and salty ocean. Using Simon Says Stamps Wave Stencil, Gina K's Glitz Glitter Gel was applied. Initially, when the stencil is removed, the little panel is quite warped, but when it dries, it completely flattens out again. Did I say there was no fussy cutting? Well, there is a little bit. I'm going to be masking this frog so that I can apply an ink blended background. The frog has been stamped on Simon Says Stamps masking paper. When trimming the frog down, I try to stay on the line or even a little bit inside the line so that when I do my ink blending, I don't end up with a halo. I used a combination of cracked pistachio, salty ocean, and peacock feathers. To create some soft clouds in the background, I used a cloud stencil and a baby wipe just to lift the ink, and then finished off with some droplets of water to create some texture. The panel was die cut with Simon stitched rectangles and also a small circle die to attach the door for the reveal. A foam circle is positioned in the center of the opening, and the door is positioned on top of it. Sheet foam is cut down slightly smaller than the panel. I then trace the circle from the panel onto the foam. A larger circle die is centered over the traced circle to die cut the foam panel. The ink blended panel is then adhered to the foam backing. The panel is placed over the door. The foam dot that was placed on the door is centered in the die cut opening on the panel. A cardstock circle that is bigger than the die cut on the panel and smaller than the one on the foam will hold the door in place. It is then adhered to a top folding A2 size card base, being careful just to get the adhesive on the foam and not anywhere near the interactive element. The door, which is supposed to be a pond, is finished up with some Copic colored lily pads and a cute little ladybug. The adhesive wasn't wanting to stick to the glitter gel, so I had to place some weight on it. The sentiment for this card will be stamped with black VersaFine ink. I'm going to stamp just the word awesome right below that frog so that it's part of the reveal. I use some Post-it note tape just to mask off the words that I don't want to stamp while I'm doing the inking, and then the tape is removed. VersaFine ink can leave some residue, and so I make sure before I stamp the rest of the sentiment that it's cleaned off well with stamp cleaner. Then I test it on a scrap piece of paper just to make sure. The first two words of the sentiment are now stamped on the front of the card. The word awesome is masked, the ink applied, the mask removed, and stamped. I didn't get a perfect impression the first time, so I restamped it, following the same procedure. Iridescent confetti is added to the pond and topped up with Nouveau Crystal Drops Morning Dew. I didn't like the gray head on the ladybug, so I darkened it with a C10 marker. I wanted to accentuate it a bit more, so I topped it up with Morning Dew. The final interactive card features the quintuple slider by Simon Says Stamp. I really like this sliding mechanism. It has a big flat surface that makes it really versatile. Because I'm using 2 large frogs, I'm not going to be making use of the 5-channel sliders for individual elements. I'm just going to cover up all of those channels with a larger panel that the frogs can peek out of. The interactive slider that you see on the left is actually a sample that I keep in the die set, so I remember how to put it together. In the sample, my sliding panel doesn't align to the top of the base. I make a slight adjustment in the placement of my die so it will line up on this card. The die that produces the panel is laid on top just to double check that alignment. I knew that I would be inking these panels, so everything is done on Bristol Smooth cardstock. A combination of Salty Ocean and Cracked Pistachio is inked at the top of the panel that we'll be showing. The sliding panel is die cut, and then I fit it onto my base panel. The panel has a series of die cuts that look like a capital H sideways. This produces 2 small tabs that are going to wrap around each of the channels. I use the craft pick to poke each of those tabs in behind the bar. The first one is a little bit tricky, but once that one is in place, the others go fairly quickly. Once everything is together, I check out the other panel that I've die cut using Pink and Main's border waves for the top of it and put my 2 frogs in just to see how everything is going to fit. And then I take it apart. The top of the sliding panel is also inked with a combination of Salty Ocean and Cracked Pistachio. Attaching it back onto the base panel the second time is very easy. Everything just slides into place. When the sliding mechanism is all together, I take some time to move that sliding panel up and down a number of times, conditioning it so that it moves smoothly. The panel with the wave border that will sit over top of the interactive mechanism is also inked with the same green and blue. There will be another panel that will be adhered to the bottom of this one. I don't bother inking all the way down to the end. That gives me a place to hang on without putting any finger marks on my ink blending. The smaller panel is cut with a grassy border die. This panel is inked with a combination of Mowed Lawn and Cracked Pistachio. The 2 frogs that are going to peek out from behind the waves are going to be adhered to the slider panel. At first, I position them with that slider panel fully extended, put the wave panel on top, and make sure that they're going to peek out from behind the waves. The frog's knees extend quite high, and I just want that head peeking through behind the waves, so I trim all the legs off. I make the final adjustments and realize that I need to add some additional color to the frog's body. A small dot of glue is used just to hold those frogs in position. Before I finish adhering the frogs, I put the slider panel in the closed position, put the wave panel over top just to make sure that those frogs are going to be completely hidden. Now for the card front. The bulrushes are stamped with Memento ink on the grassy area where the frog will be sitting. For the sentiment, I'm going to be using black VersaFine ink. This is always my go-to ink for sentiments. I like the crisp quality that it has. However, it is not Copic friendly, and so I switch back to the Memento to stamp my butterflies. After these elements are quickly colored in, then I'm ready to finish assembling the card. Foam tape is used on the back of the slider panel. This will give it a little bit of dimension, allowing that slider to move freely. As it is being applied, I make sure that I avoid the interactive element. It is adhered to a top folding A2 size card base. Because I'm also going to be adding dimension to the panel that sits over top of the interactive one, I'm using a low profile foam tape. There will be enough dimension for that slider to operate smoothly without adding too much for the overall card. My foam tape is too wide to fit along the sides of the sliding panel, so I divide it in half. I use the panel as a reference to make sure that that foam is not going to extend beyond the top of it. The sliding panel is in the closed position so that I can fill in the area below it with foam as well. The foam tape that I'm using is quite unforgiving, so I'm very careful as I adhere the panel to it. I tip it up so that I can align the bottom and then lay it down flat. The smaller grassy border is adhered directly to it. This card is going to be going through the mail, so I'm continuing with the low profile theme, but this time with foam squares. I want to avoid the possibility of the frog being crushed in the mailing process, so I put on lots of foam squares so that it's nice and stable. The frog is positioned next to the bulrushes, and this card is finished up with a few sequins topped with Nouveau Crystal Drops Morning Dew and some Nouveau Glitter Drops on both the butterflies and the bulrushes. And that wraps up this set of 3 interactive cards featuring Simon Says stamps, Totally Unforgettable. What an adorable stamp set! Young or old, male or female, who wouldn't appreciate all this cuteness and those fun sentiments? I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to subscribe. As always, I appreciate your visit.